be talking to us about the significance of font design and taking us through the font creation process. And get a 2-year honor score.
Thank you. And my score. Hi everyone, thank you for coming to my presentation. And for those of you who may not know me, again, my name is Joyce McGuire, and I am studying graphic design with a minor in web and mobile app development. Today, I'm going to be discussing with you my art project where I created a font, and a couple of things that I will be covering is both my process through creating a font as well as the related research that I did. So first, I want to get started by explaining exactly what my project is, all the work and steps that went into it, and why I decided to take interest in this project. So let's start with talking about fonts. A more literal definition of a font would be to describe a font as a design or style made for a specific set of characters. But another way to think about a font is to think of a font as the visual voice of the words we read. In graphic design, our font choice has a huge impact in the design. A good font is going to emphasize the message and strengthen the overall design. Whereas if we choose a poorly chosen font, it's going to stick out and feel really out of place. And so to give an example of the voices fonts can have, I have here 2 lines of text, and even though they say the exact same thing, they feel very different because of the fonts that they are displayed in. At the top, we have Bodoni, which is designed by Giambattista Bodoni, and this font features high contrast in its stems, and so what that means is it's got these really thick stems, but it also has these very thin and delicate hairline-like strokes as well, and what this does is it gives it this elegant and regal feel to it. On the bottom, we have Bevis New, which is designed by Roy Tsunekawa, and this font is a lot bolder than Bodoni. The letters look a lot taller, and they're also condensed. And what this does is it creates a voice that feels very strong and confident. And the lack of serifs also makes it look like a much more modern day font. And so this is what I wanted to do for my artist project. I wanted to see what kind of voice I could create within a font. And so I decided that I wanted to create a handwritten slash serif style of font that could be utilized for bodies of text. And so the voice I'm going for in my font is something that is warm and friendly and soft, like you're reading a note written from a close friend. And so that's why I wanted to go down that handwriting route, because it adds this sense of familiarity to fonts. And because I also wanted this font to be used for body text, I wanted to make sure I closely followed those conventions of font design to ensure that it stays legible. So some of the steps that I took to design my font is first to create a design brief where I laid out exactly what it is I'm going to design, how I'm going to design it, and how long am I going to take to design this. And then my next step is to research those principles of font design, create hand-drawn drafts based on my research, create the font files based on my drafts, and set the spacing and kerning. And once all of that is done, I'm able to generate the final font files. So now we're moving on to the research portion of my project, and I would first like to start by going over some common terms you'll hear when discussing font design. So in font design, there are 3 guidelines you'll want to keep in mind, which are shown in the top image. By the way, this font is Hofer, designed by Jonathan Hofer, and I will be using it for examples later on in the presentation as well. So first we have the baseline, which is just that line that all the characters sit on top of. Next we have the X height line, which is typically going to be a little more than half of the font's total height. So this would be the halfway point, and that X height line is just a little bit above it. And the X height marks the height of the lowercase x character, and all of these lowercase characters, the bodies are all going to come up to that line. And then lastly, we have the cap line, which is where we mark the top of capital characters. There's also a bunch of terms used to refer to different bits and pieces of the fonts themselves. Some of the more common ones you'll see is going to be the counters, and that is any enclosed space created in a character. So this capital letter A has a triangle counter. This O also has a counter, and this E up here has a counter as well. Lowercase characters may have ascenders, which is going to be any stem or stroke that extends past what the X height would be. The bowl is any round stroke that creates an enclosure. So for this O, this lowercase o, it has a counter, and that counter is created by a bowl. This E is another example of a bowl. However, this Y is not considered a bowl because it does not have that roundness of the O and the E. And lastly, we also might see some characters with descenders, and descenders are any parts of this letter that are going to descend below that baseline, and typically the descenders and ascenders are going to be the same in length. So as I was researching font design, I found a few different rules or similarities that came up again and again in font design, and one of those is that glyphs or characters with round forms tend to overshoot the guidelines. So here in Hofer font again, we see the lowercase o and the lowercase z, and that lowercase o is extending just a little bit past that baseline and just a little bit past that X height line, whereas that Z sits right on that baseline and just touches that X height line. And the reason for that is because if the O were to just touch those lines the same way that that Z does, it wouldn't be making as much contact with those lines. It would only be making, just barely touching those lines, whereas that Z has all of this contact, and so the O would look smaller even if it's actually not. So to counteract that, we make that O and any round forms a little bigger so that they look like they're the same size. Another common thing that I've noticed is that glyphs with open sides tend to be narrower in form than glyphs with enclosed spaces. So here we are comparing the width of the lowercase e and o, and when we overlay them on top of each other, we can clearly tell that that e is just a little bit narrower than the o. And if the reason for that is because if we were to make that e have that same width of the o, because it's open on this right side, it's missing that bit, it would have less visual density. It would seem more lightweight because it's missing that part. So to counteract that, we make it just a little bit slimmer. And so now when we see the E and O together, they feel like they're the same weight, they feel balanced. It doesn't feel like one is heavier than the other. Another similarity I noticed was that glyphs tend to be designed with stability in mind. And this manifests in all sorts of ways in font design, but one way I typically see it is that the bottom of characters are going to be designed to be wider than the top. And so in this example, we are looking at Sanchez, which is designed by Daniel Hernandez. And in that uppercase B, at first glance, you might think that the upper lobe and that lower lobe are going to be the exact same size. But once we take a guideline and put it up to that right edge of B, we notice that that lower lobe touches that guideline first, which shows us that it's actually a little bit bigger than that upper lobe. And the reason for that is because by making it bigger, it makes the B feel more stable. And similarly, we see that in the lowercase k as well, that leg is touching that guideline before the arm does. And another interesting thing to note about this particular K is that it is a double junction K. So what that means is that this arm is coming off of the stem and the leg is coming off of the arm. What we never see in double junction Ks is the leg coming off of the stem and the arm coming off of the leg. And so I was curious about this, so I decided to take that K and reconstruct it to see what it would look like the other way. And what I noticed is that in the stable version, this leg really does feel like it's holding up that arm. It really feels like it's holding up that arm. Whereas in that unstable version, it looks like there's nothing holding this arm in place. It might just start falling down that slope of the leg at any moment. That's what it feels like. It doesn't feel stable. Now, when it comes to actually designing a font in practice, it's a good place to start by grouping the characters by their similar characteristics, and letters with similar forms should be designed together so that they look related and create an overall cohesive font design. And so these were the groupings that Chang created in her book, and this is what I used to design my fonts and make sure that that it all looks related. And I won't be able to go over these forms with you here today, but I will be discussing 4 of important characters that you'll want to get started designing first. And 2 of those letters are going to be the lowercase o and l, and you'll want to design these first because they set the standards for the rest of the font. The L is going to set the standard width for stems for all the rest of the font, and the height of that L is also going to help you determine where your cap line is going to be. The O is going to set the maximum width and the X height for lowercase characters, so a majority of the characters are either going to be the same width as the O or a little bit narrower. If they're narrower, it's likely because they have an open side. Another set of characters you'll want to design is the uppercase O and E, and the O is used for reference for all of the round characters, and the E sets the proportional system, the stem width, and serif and bracket style. You'll want to make sure that that O stays circular in shape because it's like the one defining feature of the O is that it's round. If you start to make it not round, you risk the viewer not seeing it or recognizing it as that uppercase O. And it is also sometimes seen where the E's arms will stagger in length to prevent congestion in the letter. And we see that in that top example with Hofler, that bottom arm is longer than the rest. And again, this shows that letters are designed with stability in mind because they made that bottom arm be the longest. And the central arm is placed at the visual center of the letter, so oftentimes you're going to see that middle arm be just a little bit below the X height. Now that we've seen what my research for this project has involved, I'm ready to start discussing the design process for this font. And so all of the sketching and drafting was done digitally in Procreate. And my first step was to create a custom brush to use as my writing utensil. I wanted to make sure that my font drafts had that authentic handwriting look to it. So I created my own brush that I felt mimicked a pen. And my process was to start with doing rough sketches of key letters to explore the personality and proportions of the font. And so that's what we see on that left side there is me just sketching letters over and over again to see what I was wanting my font to look like. And then my next step was to sketch the word Hamburg font sif. And so what I did here was because I knew I wanted to create 2 font variations, a regular version and a bold version. I was testing different brush sizes to see what kind of weight I would be the most suitable for my fonts. I wanted my font to closely follow those principles of font design, but I also wanted to make sure that it looked like a handwriting, and so to ensure that I made my own stylistic choices and changes. One of those changes was to the lowercase g. Traditionally, as we see in the Hofler example up top, the G has a double story design. I personally don't write my G's like that. I don't know if many people do. And so I decided to simplify the G into a one-story character with a descender, similar to how the lowercase q and p's look. Another character that has a double-story design would be the lowercase a. However, I decided to keep the traditional appearance because while a single-story A is not completely unheard of, there is fonts that will have that style of A. It is definitely not as popular. Both Poplar and the much more modern font Sanchez have this lowercase a, this double-story A. And even in my drafts, if we look back at that, I was doing that double-story A in that draft too. And so I really felt like I needed to keep that traditional appearance because I felt it held a lot of personality for my font. Another letter I changed was the lowercase y, and I liked that the roundness of the bowl and the U, I felt that fit the warm and friendly and soft look of my font better than the sharpness of the V did, so I changed the Y to match the U a little more, and for consistency, I decided to give the Y the same descender as the G. In font design, the dots in the I and J oftentimes are going to line up perfectly with the stems, but in handwriting, that might not be as likely. And so what I decided to do was I first decided to make them be little dashes because perfect circles in handwriting just isn't something that we see all that often. And I also offset them slightly to the right to give that idea of the movement and flow of handwriting. And lastly, type is, of course, extremely consistent, whereas handwriting is extremely inconsistent. In type, it is common to reuse the same stems and serifs to create consistent widths and styles. And we see that in the Hofer example. The stems and serifs of the E look exactly the same in the rest of these characters. Now, handwriting, there is variations in every stroke, and all the letters vary from one another. But because this is a font, I can't make every single capital letter E look different from one another. But what I can do is I can choose to not reuse any elements and create them from scratch every single time doing these drafts. So all of these stems and strokes that I created, they're all individual from one another. So after the drafts for the glyphs are created, we're ready to move into adjusting the spacing. And to do that, we first have to get my drafts onto FontForge, which is the program I use to create my font. And so this is what a font file looks like in FontForge. What we see here is basically the character set for my set font. And what we can do is we can click onto one of these letters and it'll open up a window for that specific letter. So here is what one of those windows would look like. And what I would have done is on the guide layer, I would have created my X height line and my cap line guide for height for, my guidelines. And then on the blue back layer, I would have used that layer to import my draft. And on the foreground layer, which is on top of everything, I used that layer to recreate the outline of my drafts with Bezier points. So after So after getting the fonts created, I'm ready to start working on doing the spacing for the font. And a font is considered well-spaced when it has even tonal value. And the body text will have wider spacing, while the display text can have tighter spacing. So on the well-spaced example on the left, there's enough air to read the letters in that body text. It doesn't become too cramped. And if we squint at it, we can see that there is no changes in that tonal value. However, if we look at that core example on the right, the spacing is just way too tight. Some of the letters start to run into each other, and what we notice when we squint is it actually starts to create these kind of like dark patches within that paragraph. And for the title, the display text, while both are still legible, I would say it does take a little longer to read that right side because the letters are so far apart that they like start to disassociate from one another, so it just takes a little bit more to piece that title together. Whereas on the left, I can read it instantly and it feels a lot stronger as a title. So to start working on that spacing, we first have to set the side bearings and then do the kerning. And the side bearings is the default space defined on the left and right sides of the glyph. A glyph's width consists of that empty space on the left, the glyph itself, and then the empty space on the right. And so the side bearings vary on each character because the characters all vary in shapes. Walter Tracy has created a formula to determine the side bearings for upper and lowercase characters, and that image here kind of gives you an idea of what Walter Tracy's formula is. So what you first do is you'll set for the uppercase characters, for example, you'll set the side bearings for that uppercase H and do the first test. And what we're looking for in these tests is we're looking to make sure that the spacing between all the letters feels the same and it feels harmonious. And you'll continue to do tests, and once these four letters pass the test, you'll be able to set the side bearings for all the rest of your alphabet. After the side bearings are set, we can start to move on to kerning. And what kerning does is it adjusts the space between specific letter combinations, and it's common for characters with open or diagonal sides to need kerning regardless of what you set your side bearing. However, setting side bearings is still a very important step to do that you'll want to do before setting kerning, because a font with proper side bearing is going to require less kerning, and the less kerning the better, because kerning can be an extremely tedious process, and Thomas Finney recommends making no more than 3,000 kerning pairings. And so in our example image here, we have at the top what a font looks like after I've kerned it, and then in the middle, a no kerning example, and then at the bottom, a comparison. And so when we look at that example with no kerning, we can see that there is some awkward spacing within certain letter combinations. One I noticed is that this A seems to almost not even be a part of the word because of that awkward spacing. And there's some weird distance between this A and Y. When we look at this set of letters, that E looks much closer to the R, and so it looks like it should be a little farther away from that R and a little closer to the V. There's some issues right here, and when we look at these combinations up above on that kerning example, we notice that these spacing issues are addressed, and we no longer see those weird moments in the spacing. And that comparison shows that when you have long lines of text, kerning can make a pretty big difference. They start to look pretty different. So this is what setting the kerning in FontForge looks like. It's made in the settings, and I chose to organize the kerning pairings into, I think that's 5 different categories. And so what I'll do is I will write some words in my font, and to search for letter combinations that I think need to be fixed, and then once I find one, I'll open up the settings and go into that category and create a new entry. And so what all of these are is they're all separate individual entries that I created where I put in the first letter, the second letter, and then the adjustments that I think need to be made. And so there is a good number of current parents for sure. I don't know how many, it wouldn't count them for me, but I'm certain it's over 500 in each, so over 1,000 overall. And once the kerning is done, the font is designed, and we have our final font that we can generate and use. And so that's what I did. I generated my fonts. My font is called Cordial pen. It has a bold version, which we see in the title, and a regular version, which we see displaying my name. And it's been a really good experience designing this font, very eye-opening, and I really enjoyed it because typography is something that I've just been very interested in, and that pretty much brings my presentation to a wrap. So, if there's any questions?